journalist, poet, and theater maker, the early African intellectual H.I.E. Dlomo, back in February 1944, in an article captioned "The Campbells and African Culture," described Dr. Killie Campbell as follows. Ms. Campbell has one of the finest, perhaps the finest private libraries of Afrikaans. Unlike some collectors, Ms. Campbell's effort is a work of love. She takes a living practical interest in her work and is never so happy as when she helps visitors and scholars in her library. The library is a paradise for all lovers of culture and literature. It contains many rare items: books, periodicals, cuttings, letters, pictures, close quote. Good afternoon. My name is Mwalela Cele. I'm the Deputy Head of Research and Innovation at KwaZulu-Natal AMAFA and Research Institute, the Provincial Heritage Resources Authority for KwaZulu-Natal. It is an honor to greet and welcome you all as I facilitate this program of the Dr. Killie Campbell Lecture, presented by the University of KwaZulu-Natal Campbell Collections. On a personal level, which I take the liberty of sharing here, for me, this is a homecoming, because for 10 years, I worked for the University of KwaZulu-Natal, firstly at the Documentation Center Westville campus and Digital Innovation South Africa, DISA, and then UKZN Campbell Collections. My sincere thanks for the invitation go to Mr. Senzo Mkhize, Head of Campbell Collections. I would like to begin by expressing appreciation to all organizers of this lecture, including Mr. Senzo Mkhize and Ms. Pamela Adams, my friends of many years, and also appreciation to Campbell Collections team of colleagues. It is indeed a pleasure to greet and welcome academics, senior management, and support staff of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I greet students and all those attending this event, librarians, archivists, historians, researchers, other professionals, organic intellectuals, and other friends of Campbell Collections and Special Collections, to mention but a few. With respect, special greetings to Dr. Nonhlanhla Ngcobo, Director of Library Services, University of KwaZulu-Natal. And with respect, special greetings to Dr. Roshni Pada, Portfolio Head, Special Collections, Library Services, University of KwaZulu-Natal. It is also an honor to greet my friend, Professor Hlonipha Mokoena, who will be delivering the Dr. Killie Campbell lecture titled The Life and Times of Make Mafuze. My eager anticipation to hear Professor Mokoena's lecture triggers another personal memory, as I was privileged last year to read the words of Make Mafuze, in other words, becoming Make Mafuze, for a podcast of the 500-year archive research initiative, Emandulo Makema Magwaza Fuze Archive, a project of archive and public culture based at the University of Cape Town. Another indication of the importance of Fuze's contribution to South African historiography. Professor Mokoena was involved during the curation of the aforementioned archive. The sequence of the program will be as follows. Dr. Nonhlanhla Ngcobo, Director of Library Services, University of KwaZulu-Natal, will welcome and introduce the guest speaker, Professor Hlonipha Mokoena, who will then deliver the Dr. Killie Campbell lecture titled, as already mentioned, The Life and Times of Make Mafuze. Subsequently, we will move to questions and answers, which process I will facilitate. After the Q&A, Dr. Roshni Pada, Portfolio Head, Special Collections Library Services, UKZN, will present the vote of thanks and closure. Proceedings can now commence. I would like to invite Dr. Nonhlanhla Ngcobo to introduce our speaker. Over to you, Mapolo.
Siyabonga Mwelela. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the Dr. Killie Campbell Lecture 2023. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Hlonipha Mokoena. Professor Mkwena is an associate professor and researcher at WISER, and WISER is an acronym which stands for Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, which is at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Professor Mkwena is the author of Make Mafuze, The Making of a Kholwa Intellectual, and has a strong research interest in South African intellectual history. She received a PhD from the University of Cape Town in 2005, my apologies. Her articles have been published in various journals, including the Journal of Natal and Zulu History, Journal of Religion in Africa, Journal of Southern African Studies, UFAM, a Journal of African Studies, Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, Image and Text, and Critical Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Professor Hlonipha Mkwena. Prof, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nhlanhla Ngcobo, and thank you so much to Mwelela for that very warm welcome. I'd like to basically thank the Killie Campbell Library for organizing this event, but more importantly, I actually want to share a little bit of a memory with you about why, in fact, I'm sad that we are not at the Killie Campbell Library, because I can remember almost vividly that when I would get tired, my eyes would get tired from the microfiche machine. I would go and walk on these beautiful cobblestone steps, and I would walk down into the garden at the Killie Campbell Library, so the former home of Dr. Killie Campbell. And I would rest my eyes, and sometimes I would actually fall asleep and take a little nap on the steps. So I'm very thankful to Dr. Killie Campbell just for her garden, because it offered the perfect respite from long hours on the microfiche machine. What I'm going to, I should also thank my mother, not because she's my mother, but because she's a great publicist. So I forgot to tell my mom that I was doing this lecture until about 2 days ago. And when I told my mom, she immediately went into action and called people and invited people and sent the invitation around. So thank you, Mom, for being a great publicist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit, and I then will just talk about how Make Mafuze has changed my research. I will probably spend about 15 minutes or so, and then use the rest of the time for questions, because I think actually it would be more interesting. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, I hope that everyone can see my screen. So I am going to talk about obscurity, the life and times of Make Mafuze. Obscurity is a consequence of many things. In their lifetime, any author may be, to use the cliche, a household name. But within a few decades, he may be forgotten. Time acts on our literary memory and corrodes the traces of an author's ideas and work. It may also be the case that an author becomes obscure because of the selectivity of the canon. Some authors are lionized and reread, while some authors are left to accumulate dust on library shelves and archives. Ideas themselves have a shelf life. A writer who is relevant today may become outmoded tomorrow. It may even be the case that the writer's ideas are imminently perishable and were only potent within a limited historical time. Or perhaps the ideas are and were so opaque that they are difficult to understand and decipher, and have therefore become a form of specialized or even esoteric knowledge. Obscurity, thus defined, is certainly one characteristic of the work of Make Mafuze. As the author of Abantu Abamnyama Lapha Bavela Ngakhona Fuze has been acknowledged and cited as the first Zulu speaker to publish a book in the Zulu language. And yet, little else is known about who he was and how he became a writer. The translated version of the book, The Black People and Whence They Came, which was published in 1979, is a standard reference for historians working on the history of the Zulu people. Paradoxically, the other aspect of the book, its attempt to map the migratory routes of African peoples on the continent, its ethnography of Black Africa, and its self-conscious address to posterity are only mentioned in passing or dismissed as idiosyncratic. The original 1922 publication is hardly ever read, since the 1979 English translation has become the classic and representative text. My short presentation is about these two kinds of obscurity. The first being the obscurity of the author, and the second being the obscurity of the Zulu text, Abantu Abamnyama Lapha Bavela Ngakhona. Now, one of the reasons why Makema Fuze's book has sort of become obscure is that in some ways the author himself is a disappearing subject. This is the only photograph that we have of Makema Fuze. There are no other photographs that we have found or that exist that we know of Makema Fuze. And because he was a smart man, Makema Fuze included this photograph in the book that he published in 1920. And for those of you who can read, the book was published in 1922. For those of you who can read, he actually signed the photograph and he wrote Yimina Makema Damakwaza, December 1920. So this photograph was taken 2 years before Makema Fuze died. Now I'm going to take you back to this slide. This is an artist's attempt to paint or depict Makema Fuze. It was made for a film that I worked on during the pandemic in 2020 to 2021. And the film is called Amashinga. And I was contacted by a British director, Bex Singleton, who asked if she could consult with me on the use of Makema Fuze's voice to narrate basically the last year of the life or the kingdom of the Zulus, so the reign of the Zulu king Cetshwayo. Bex Singleton was directing this film called, at the time she had a different name, but it eventually became Amashinga, based on my suggestions. And we played around with several ideas, but it became clear that because of the pandemic, you couldn't have face-to-face conversations between actors. And so we had to work on some kind of narration. And in order to have narrators, you had to have voice actors. And so in the background, you would have had a voice actor. And then when I told her about this problem, that there's only one photograph of Makema Fuze that exists, this was the alternative. And I don't know what many of you think, but this was a very interesting depiction of an African man. There are certain aspects. I think I even shared this image with my mother and asked her what she thinks of Makema Fuze as a film star. So this is Makema Fuze essentially as a film star, and this is how he would have looked in the film. I'm not sure that the film is going to be available in South Africa, but it's sort of stuck in post-production. I hope it will be, but I wanted to bring you to this image because it's also about obscurity. How do you create a face for someone who in some ways is kind of faceless? So let's get back to a brief biographical sketch of Makema Fuze. Superficially, Makema Fuze's life is similar to that of many other converts to Christianity. He attends a mission school, learns to read and write, pens a few letters, and at the end of his life, writes and publishes a book. By belonging to this class of mission-educated Africans, Fuze's choice to write seems unremarkable. There are several examples in the history of South African letters of specifically men who chose to write as part of their conversion experience. Many of them have been written about and eulogized. So for example, Catherine Higgs's book, The Ghost of Equality, about DDT Jabavu, Tim Cousins' book, The New African, about H.I.E. Dlomo, and Brian Williams' book on Sol Plaatje, which has been republished, I think was republished about 2 years ago, are a few examples of biographies of what people have called new Africans of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Until I wrote a book on Makema Fuze, no biography of Fuze existed. Now, one of the things that I need to give you a sense of, so that's my book on Fuze, if you are interested. It's published by UKZN Press. I would like to give you a sense of the terrain that Makema Fuze traveled. So Makema Fuze was already born in what became the colony of Natal. So that thick black line is what is the Tugela River today. And Makema Fuze was born on the south side of the Tugela River. And as you can see on the screen, you have the Bishop Stowe. So I'm just gonna, I was trying to highlight the, so this is Bishop Stowe right here, where Makema Fuze spent basically his childhood. But Colenso did not limit his converts to living at Bishop Stowe. Soon enough, after their conversion to Christianity, Colenso took his converts across the border, so across this thick black line, what used to be the thick black line, into the kingdom of the Zulu, so this northern part here. And he took them to visit the king, the Zulu king Mbande. And this was in 1859. The book that they produced of their travel, actually for a while, became one of the most popular books in isiZulu. And it was called Three Native Accounts. Now, this is where you begin to see the issues of obscurity and the meaning of the word author. Colenso was essentially hovering in the background as the missionary and the teacher. And he had given his students, obviously, diaries to keep accounts of what they saw. The book was a bilingual book. And this also sort of speaks to a lot of the issues that we are constantly discussing in South Africa about what does it mean to be a multicultural, multilingual society. Three Native Accounts was a bilingual text. There was the Zulu version of the story, and then Colenso's translation from isiZulu into English. So already you have a study in translation, you have a study in travel narrative, and then you have a study in the meaning of conversion. So just to give you one of my best stories from the Three Native Accounts involves what happens on the way back as Colenso and his converts are trying to now make their way back to the colony of Natal. Apparently, as they are riding off in their horses and wagons, these Zulu girls appear out of nowhere. And then they say to them, won't you put us in your baggage and take us to Eslungwini? Won't you? And in isiZulu, they literally said something like, we would be like izimbungulu in your blankets, and nobody would even notice that we are here. And Colenso has to then congratulate his converts on the fact that they had to turn these two Zulu girls back and say, no, 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 we would get into trouble with the Zulu king for stealing his people. So this is how, at the time, that crossing the border would have been interpreted as theft of people. So the first, if I could call it, refugee crisis that would have been created by Colenso's converts was averted by the converts telling these two Zulu girls that, no, no, you cannot become refugees in the colony of Natal. Now, this story of people attempting to cross that thick black line actually defined Makema Fuze's life, because he, in 1878, had to make the same trip as an older man to now visit the successor of King Mbande, and that was King Cetshwayo. This time, it was the killing of a convert that Colenso was investigating. Now, this is one of the best texts, again, on what I would call Colenso's interest in forensics. So before long, Colenso started being interested in the details of what was going on between these two independent areas, the colony of Natal and the kingdom of the Zulu. Colenso started investigating the relationships between the Zulus who were living south of the Tugela and the Zulus who were living north of the Tugela. And this was one of those instances where he sent his convert, Make Mafuze, to investigate what was claimed the murder of a Christian convert. And so again, Make Mafuze becomes an inadvertent travel writer. He crosses in 1878. And that article of Make Mafuze, the description of Make Mafuze's travels to the kingdom of the Zulu, was published in Macmillan's magazine. And again, for me, it is the language that Colenso uses. He opens the Macmillan's magazine article by saying, such exaggerated accounts have been sent to England about the king of the Zulus, Cetshwayo. So that line, such exaggerated accounts, was already the beginning of Colenso's opposition to colonialism, to specifically settler colonialism, where he was like, how dare you send all these stories to England, telling people that the Zulu king is murdering converts. I sent one of my most trusted converts to the kingdom. Now, number one, nothing happened to him. And number two, the story is more complicated than just King Cetshwayo murdering converts. So Make Mafuze then, at two ends of his life, functioned as a travel writer. If you don't have a copy of The Black People and Whence They Came, this is it. That's just a quick pause. So how did I then deal with this life, this loop, if I could call it that way, of writing between colonies, between the colony and the kingdom, and then Make Mafuze himself having been trained as a printer? Because by the time he is traveling in 1878 to visit the Zulu king, he is already a trained printer. I decided to treat Make Mafuze as an author like any other author. So I didn't limit myself to reading on just African literature. So I didn't want Make Mafuze to be just a Black writer or to be just an African writer. And one of the books that influenced my interpretation of Make Mafuze is this classic book that was published by Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is often credited as the father of media studies. He was one of the first people to basically study mass media. And he coined the phrase, if any of you are interested, the medium is the message. And what he meant by that is that any change in the world of media, whether it's the introduction of print journalism or the introduction of television, or even the introduction of light bulbs, he said that is the message. There is no other meaning. The surface is the message. Is that so? For example, with light bulbs, it's the fact that you can have day and night in 24 hours. You never, all day, and you never have to have night. So he, for example, famously used the example of baseball games. Said baseball would not be the same sport in America if it couldn't be played at night. And so the introduction of the light bulb allowed people to play sports at night, which would never have been possible before the invention of the light bulb. So he coined that phrase, the medium is the message. But how is he relevant to Make Mafuze? This is one of the most beautiful quotes that changed the way that I read Make Mafuze. He said, print, in turning the vernaculars into mass media, created the uniform centralizing forces of modern nationalism. So this allowed me to basically think of Make Mafuze as a nationalist writer, as a writer who was essentially creating a nation out of words. He was creating a Black nation, he was creating an African nation, he was creating a Zulu nation out of words. The second writer who I think influenced my understanding of Make Mafuze, again, a non-African literature, non-Black writer, was Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin famously wrote an essay on translation and the difficulty of translation, and the fact that a translation actually is a new text. It is never the original text. this is what he said. He said a translation issues from the original, not so much from its life as from its afterlife. For a translation comes later than the original. And since the important works of world literature never find their chosen translators at the time of their origin, their translation marks their stage of continued life. So this changed the way that I thought about the gap between Make Mafuze's original text of 1922 and the gap that then exists between that and the translation of 1979. When I started doing my work on Make Mafuze, I was very uncharitable towards the translator of Make Mafuze. I said, well, I was going to criticize the way that they had butchered Make Mafuze's text, the way that they had rearranged Make Mafuze's text, etc., etc., until I read Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin said, hang on with the judgments. A translation is always an afterlife. It does not matter who does it. It does not matter how good they are or how much of an expert they are. It is an afterlife of the original text. And so that changed my approach to translation, but also my approach to Make Mafuze. The last slide that I'd like to talk about before I open for questions is Nadine Gordimer. And again, Nadine Gordimer was one of those people that I read in order to understand the larger context of South African letters, what I would call South African letters. What distinguishes a Black writer from a quote unquote white writer, or an African writer from a non-African writer? And Nadine Gordimer, again, sort of tempered my enthusiasm for making this distinction between Black writing and white writing and some of the theoretical positions that I was trying to take. She said, whether a writer is Black or white, in South Africa, the essential gesture by which he enters the brotherhood of man, which is the only definition of society that has any permanent validity, is a revolutionary gesture. It is that last phrase, is a revolutionary gesture, that changed my approach, because it told me that it doesn't matter whether someone is a Black writer or a white writer. The very fact of writing is the essential gesture. And so I began to think of Make Mafuze as just a revolutionary writer, precisely because he chose to write. I will pause there and go back to my first slide, and hopefully there are some questions which will make it easy for me to continue with the conversation, because as I say, I'm aware that we only have about 30 minutes, and I'd much rather have questions rather than just me talking. So I hope that I've given you a sense of the arc of Make Mafuze's life, the fact that his writing life begins in about 1859 as a young, he was probably only about 14 years of age in 1859. And one of the classic texts of isiZulu, which I can't even show to you because most of you Zulu speakers would be scandalized by the way the isiZulu is written, is called Amazwi Abantu, which was written at exactly the same time as 3 native accounts. And it's Make Mafuze experimenting with what Marshall McLuhan called the typographic man. He is learning to type, but because he's learning to type isiZulu and there are no conventions yet, there are all sorts of letters that we would never recognize in today's isiZulu. Like clicks are represented with Q's, with lines drawn through the Q, or a C with a line drawn through the C. And I was like, okay, sitting in the archives trying to read this text. And it is the most beautiful text, exactly because it's written by a 14-year-old who was literally just writing down people's conversations and then just putting it all together into this long, almost like a poem, which is probably, I think it's probably more than 200 lines long. And it contains everything. Stories about horses and animals, and the river is full. Umzinyati ugcwele, umngeni ugcwele. You know, it's just like these beautiful Zulu phrases that are sort of like descriptions of everyday life, but it also contains politics. Things like sahlulwa thina zigqoza, and it's literally just like an izigqoza were the kind of the Muyazi group that was so Muyazi was the brother of Cetshwayo, and he sort of in order to eliminate his brothers, Cetshwayo essentially picked a fight with his younger brother Mbuyaz, and Izikoza were chased over that thick black line. So it's full of those kinds of political words, like you have to know who the Izikoza were, etc., etc. So I hope I've given you a sense of that arc of Make Mafuze's life, the fact that his writing life begins in about 1859 and sort of ends in 1922 when he dies and his book is published. And he basically wrote throughout those decades. There was never a kind of pause in Make Mafuze's life as a writer. So I'll pause there and ask if there are questions. I can already see that there are some questions in the chat. So let me, if you don't mind, I'm gonna leave up my little reimagined Make Mafuze, just so that we have something to look at as well. Mwelela, is this, yeah.
Well, yes, thank you, Prof. Thank you very much for this very insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Fitting tribute to Dr. Killie Campbell, but I know we're not at the end yet, but maybe while we're waiting for questions, I can maybe ask the first question.
Okay.
Yeah, but this question is a light question. It comes from someone like me, someone who's because I'm an archivist, as you know, and a librarian, and I'm very much, interested in research, etc. So please tell us about the archival work or research,
okay,
the techniques behind the researching and writing of your book on Make Mafuze, the special collections that you consulted. Just while we're, there is a question now from Tingani, but yeah, maybe
I should start with that question. Okay, so as
he says, may you say more about the question, the quotation print interning, yeah, something like that.
Okay. The first thing that I want to say is that the research process, as I was explaining to you, was actually quite painful. So most people now sort of think of Google when they think of research. There was no Google. I had to search for every single article with my own eyes. So I had to sit there with the microfiche machine. So the Killie Campbell library actually has one of the best microfiche machines because it's got like a PDF reader. So it scans, you can scan the page, not like the old ones where you have to photocopy the page and then it comes out in an A4 size. So many of these newspapers that Make Mafuze was writing for were actually full-blown tabloid size. So I would have to sit there literally with my eyes open and just scan the pages. I'm looking for Fuze, Makema, Fuze, Makwaza, and I'm just scanning the pages. And then I would get distracted because then it would be like an advert or something like that. That would be like, oh, that looks interesting. Oh, that looks interesting. And so I would, in part, have to keep a lid on my own enthusiasm for all the other material that was in the old newspapers, while at the same time looking for Make Mafuze. You had problems like deterioration. Some of the copies had deteriorated. So, newspapers like Iphepha Lohlanga, Inkanyiso are sort of almost yellow in color. So when you scan them or when you literally get a yellow page and then like this tiny, tiny black text. So half the time you have to magnify the text. So you definitely need technology, like you need a computer that can magnify a PDF copy. So that was the one. So the Killie Campbell, I use the Killie Campbell a lot. And then the Sir George Grey Library in Cape Town. That's where I found Amazwi Abantu. And then I also found the paintings and sketches done by Make Mafuze. So for this, I thank Dr. Vugile Kumalo, who told me about this. But when he told me, I thought, oh, Zulu boys, 14 years of age, they're definitely drawing stick figures. So I was going there just for the entertainment, like, okay, let's see what's there. I was so shocked. They were getting proper art lessons. So one of the things that I often say to people is that Egukhanyeni was also the first art school in South Africa. These young boys who had never in their lives seen an art gallery who had never in their lives seen a painting were sketching windmills, and they were sketching landscapes. They were doing busts. They were doing shadows, and oh, it. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, this changes the history of art in South Africa. Make Mafuze, in some ways, was also South Africa's first Black artist, like a proper sort of Western trained Black artist. So, I mean, those are all the issues that I couldn't even get into in the book. So I put in the book some of the images that Make Mafuze and his classmates did. So that was the Killie Campbell, the George Gray Library at the National Library of South Africa. But one of the most moving experiences was when I went to look at the New York Public Library. So now I'm working at Columbia University, and there is this report that Colenso wrote in 1874 about Langa Libalele and the trial of Langa Libalele, in which Make Mafuze was involved. So again, I go to the library with no expectations, because this report has been described as a pamphlet. Now, when someone says pamphlet, you are not thinking 100 pages, you are thinking 5 pages. Colenso had written a 300+ page report on the destruction of Langa Libalele and the Amashubi. And Make Mafuze was all over it. He was the printer, he had interviewed witnesses, he had been hauled in front of a court by Theophilus Shepstone, so he had become a witness. And it's full of this contest between John William Colenso, and Theophilus Shepstone. And again, when I went to the New York Public Library, I think I was probably the first person to open that report. And so to get a copy, I still have a photocopied copy in my office, even though I have the digital version now. It is almost like a forensic report. And again, Make Mafuze was involved. So I just wanted to highlight those sort of 4 moments in the archives, and then deal with this question of, thank you for putting up the Emandulo link. Yes. Okay. Yes, there's a question by Dingane there. And so Dingane, the question about vernacular, and again, I don't particularly like the word vernacular. It has a lot of complications, and partly it's because if you actually look at the origins of the word vernacular, it actually comes from the Greek word for slave. So when you say vernacular, you're essentially saying the language of the slaves. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like the word vernacular. But what Marshall McLuhan was really meaning, he was meaning people's everyday languages. So he really was generalizing, talking about vernacular, meaning also the vernacularization of Europe, because the language of intellectual work in Europe had been Latin. And so that process of, this is why his book is called The Gutenberg Galaxy, when, print allows people to start writing in their own languages, French, German, Italian, Spanish, etc., etc. So when he used the word vernacular, he was really talking about the global emergence of vernacular print. So for me, as I said, the reason why that quote became so important was that it gave dignity and it gave gravitas to these newspapers that were published by Christian converts in South Africa, sort of beginning in the 1860s, with newspapers like Isigidi, Misamaxhosa, etc. So South Africa, on the African continent, actually has one of the longest traditions of Black journalism on the African continent, precisely because it starts very early. Most other African countries, people only start publishing their own newspapers and magazines in the 1900s, like 1920s, 1930s. So South Africa has got the longest tradition of Black journalism. So for me, Marshall McLuhan was important for that reason. And then the second question that Dingane asks me is about a book which I consider to be quite controversial. This book by Jochen Arndt called Divided by the Word. I was asked to respond to this book. It's a very complicated set of issues because what Jochen Ant essentially argues is that Zulu speakers and Xhosa speakers are oppressing Amahlubi because we are forcing them to speak our language. But actually, it's not really true. So if I'm going to just give you one example. The isiHlubi dialect, or the dialect that is spoken by Amahlubi, does have a name in isiZulu. It's called Amampembe. And to speak Amampembe is to just speak a dialect of Zulu. Most of the Hlubi words. So I went and looked online at some of these words that people were claiming are a separate language from isiZulu and isiXhosa. 99.9% of the words are in the Doke and Vilakazi dictionary. So let me give you an example of a word which most of us as Zulu speakers have probably never used, but actually is a Zulu word, Igwanya. Now, these young people were claiming that Zulus don't know what the word Igwanya means. And they said in their language, it means a puppy. If you go to the Doke and Vilakazi dictionary, it says any young animal or a young person who is still growing. That is the definition. So, well, yeah, if you call it a puppy, it fits in with the definition that is in the Doke and Vilakazi. So there were many words like that, words like ijigi. So ijigi turns out to be alcohol, uchwala, and it is in the Doke and Vilakazi. So as Zulu speakers, in some ways, I think we are responsible for the conclusions reached by Jochen Ant, which is that we are not using our full vocabulary, which our ancestors have given to us. I mean, how many of us would ever say, you would never say really that in Zulu, but it's a Zulu word and we are free to use it. It's in the dictionary. Like I say, it's in the Doke and Vilakazi. So a lot of the words which people were saying, or a lot of the grammatical changes. So for example, words like iso. In Zulu, you can say iliso, isho, ilisho. That is not a different language just because you've called it ilisho. You are still speaking isiZulu. And these are all the issues that were in the book, which I just found very confusing. It's like, why pick on this issue? But I've said enough about it. All I can say to you is the dialect, which he calls isiHlubi, in isiZulu, it's called Amampembe. And it is there in the Doke and Vilakazi, described as exactly that, to speak isiZulu with the Hlubi dialect. So our ancestors acknowledged the Amahlubi as having their own dialect. So I don't know where the oppression is then. But as I say, I responded to it in the seminar. Yes, and thank you for pointing out the Amandulo website. You kindly ask what are some of the ethical dilemmas that an inspiring writer can find themselves in, especially based on the observational experiences. I'm gonna try and answer the question about ethical dilemmas. Well, one of the basic ethical dilemmas that I faced was thinking about Makema Fuze's family and descendants. I asked around, a lot of people would say to me, well, first and foremost, Makema Fuze's descendants changed their surname to Ngobo, which is one of the clan names of Fuze. And at some point, somebody told me that they know one of his descendants, they will put me in touch, and it just never happened. So that is kind of an ethical dilemma. But the main response to that ethical dilemma is that Makema Fuze published everything in public. There's nothing that was in a public library or a private library, except perhaps his will, which he sent to Harriet Colenso, and it was in the Harriet Colenso collection. That was one of the most difficult texts for me to analyze, because in the will, he reveals a lot of personal information about himself. So that was the second ethical dilemma. But as I say, as a biographer, I have to take it that since he sent his will to Harriet Colenso, he sort of wanted it to be public. So that is my response to that question. And then the other question, Carolyn, thank you. Hi. focusing attention on Fuze's obscurity also allows us to think about the ways in which Professor Mokwena's own book and the online Makema Magwaza Fuze archive place Fuze in a spotlight for posterity. From obscurity, then, his life and legacy have become a multiply loaded public symbol, bearing an enormous weight, including entering film media. I would love to hear Professor Mokwena's reflections on this shift. Oh, Carolyn, yeah, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So I'll tell you something that my supervisor, Professor Andre Dutoy, asked me a question which I never expected someone to ask me. It actually gave me shivers down my spine. And he waited until I had finished with my dissertation. So close to the end of his life, from 1920 to about 1922, Makema Fuze wrote a series of articles called Umuntu Agafi Apele. Now, that is one of the most difficult sentences I've ever had to translate in isiZulu, because there is no English equivalent. So you say, okay, when a person dies, that is not the end of them. When the person dies, that is not the end of him. When a person dies, that is not the end. But it doesn't quite capture the three Zulu words, Umuntu Agafi Apele. And Makema Fuze was essentially talking about the idea that we become reincarnated. When we die, it's not the end, we live another life. So I wrote an entire chapter on Makema Fuze's Umuntu Agafi Apele. And I finished my dissertation, and Andre Dutoy sits me down in his office and looks at me, and after like talking about the dissertation and how difficult it is, and he was saying to me, oh, you know, it's like giving birth to a child. Blah, blah, blah. He then looked at me and said, do you think that you are a reincarnation of Makema Fuze? And I remember looking at him thinking, Andre, are you now a believer? Are you now a believer? So I was like, a reincarnation of Makema Fuze? Like when? Like what? What has this got to do with my dissertation? So I can remember being so shocked and thinking, well, maybe, how do I know? How am I going to verify? How am I going to verify that? But in a way, it feels as if Makema Fuze was right. He sort of knew he would come back again. He was just like, you people think you can shut me up. I'm coming back. This is not the last that you hear of me. So in a bizarre kind of way, he was absolutely correct that he was going to come back, that his death was not the end of his life, that I was going to live, I'm going to live again, and I'm going to live again, and I'm going to live again. So in a way, it kind of like, it's almost like in the same way that some people have, in psychology, you have something that's called a death wish. So sometimes they say that sometimes you die, not because it was your time to die, but because you had a death wish. You've been thinking about your death and wishing about your death. Makema Fuze had a life wish. He was like, I'm going to live, and I'm going to live, and I'm going to live, and I'm going to live. So it's sort of like, sometimes this is what they mean, that you are so tough and so determined that it doesn't matter what pushes you out of the way or what gets you, what obstacles you face. You're like, I'm going to live my life, and I'm going to live it again, I'm going to live it again, I'm going to live it again, I'm going to live it. So in a way, this is very bizarre that Makema Fuze kind of knew that he was going to come back in one way or another, that even though his own contemporaries may not have taken him as seriously as perhaps they should have, that he was going to live. Okay, I have another question. What a significant presentation to end our Heritage Month. Thank you. I look forward to a library, museum, lecture hall, or any monumental structure to be named after such a profound author. Well, take that to the Gov. You must start a campaign to have something named after Makema Fuze. For me, though, I think something that is much more profound is to actually try and get more of his work, because I'm pretty sure that my eyes didn't find everything. And we can powerfully think ancestors and archives and afterlife. in a common ontological and epistemological frame. Yes, yeah. I mean, as I say, it gives you shivers, you know. So, for example, I'll give you another example. When we were shooting Shaka Ilembe, I promised you, I mean, if we could write a book about people feeling the ancestors, people just, it was bizarre. Like on the very first day of the shoot, I got a phone call. So for those of you who are here, you're getting insider info about what happened on the Shaka Ilembe set. I get a phone call from the director, Angus Gibson. He says to me, and he's got poor reception, they're out in Magaliesburg. He says to me, Hlonipa, what is a praying mantis in Zulu? And I'm like, oh my God, Angus, don't touch the praying mantis. I am trying. Now, in Zulu, I go blank because I'm so shocked that the very first question I get asked is about praying mantises. And I'm thinking, don't kill it. It's someone's grandmother. No, I can't say that to Angus Gibson. It would be confusing to say it's someone's grandmother. No, you can't say that. So in my mind, I'm editing myself. So I forget the Zulu word for praying mantis. So I say something like, something weird like that. And then I put the phone down. And literally like a minute after I've put down the phone, I said, oh no, that's the wrong word. I know it's the wrong word. I had forgotten the word Istwalambiza because I was so shocked that the first item that I get asked to comment on for Shaka Ilembe is a praying mantis. I'm like, which ancestral spirit is now making its presence known through the praying mantis? So, I mean, if you just think about the power of the praying mantis in South African mythology, from the San all the way to the Azulu, you know, Istwalambiza is like, yeah, it has a lot of significance. It has a lot of, even my own clan, apparently the Buthelezi, Istwalambiza is considered to be, like if you are married into the Buthelezi clan, you are not supposed to kill Istwalambiza. Things like that. And that was the first question I got asked. So yes, the ancestors and archive and epistemology, and sometimes we need to humble ourselves. That's my comment, Carolyn. Humble ourselves and know that we don't know. I think what's his name? Hamlet said there are more things in heaven and earth than are in your philosophy, Horatio. So I always remember that line from Hamlet whenever I'm confronted with these issues, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are in our philosophy. So thank you, Carolyn, for that. How much time do we still have?
Well, we have about 10 minutes, but 5 minutes, the last 5 minutes will be for the vote of thanks. I just have another maybe short question, and then
Okay.
we can move on. Right. Can you tell us your interpretation of Make Mafuze's role during the trial of Inkosi Langalibalele in 1874 and the series of articles on the subject published in UKZN? I'm asking this because, as I said earlier, I was involved in the podcast, the Emandulo podcast. So I was very inspired when I was, reading Makema's writing. And also the other interesting thing is his writing style. I mean, I would like, how did you deal with it? Because, I mean, he refers to Cape Town as Yekipi, like the way some words that it was when we were doing rehearsals, we were to sort of discuss and say, can we work with this word? What is the meaning? What is the meaning of this? So my question is around that.
Well, I don't want to talk too much about the Langalibalele because it's actually a chapter in my forthcoming book, which I'm supposed to be finishing for the publishers, and I'm late. So I've written an entire book on the history of what I call the night watchman. So in my view, Langalibalele fits into that large problem of South Africa, which is that, and this is something that I hope, I don't know whether I'm going to break the discipline yet again. I think Makemafuze broke the discipline, and now I think I'm gonna break the discipline again. Because actually it occurred to me while I was doing the research that our understanding of colonialism is based on the idea that colonialism only happened during the day. We actually do not have a theory for the colonial night and what that looks like. So The Night Watchman is essentially the book that I'm writing. It's about how colonialism also takes place after sunset. And these men who were essentially being hired by different colonial governments to act as night watchmen. And this term, night watchman, covers the entire period from the Dutch period all the way up to the unification of the South African Police Service, which only happens in 1913. So something like 3 years after South Africa becomes a unitary state, we then have a single police service in the country. That was the first time. So from the Dutch period, the 1700s, all the way up to 1913, I essentially went and looked for these men, like Langa Libalele. Many of them would end up on trial, exactly because at some point they would become woke, as we would say now. They would realize that, hang on a minute, we've got the guns and these guys depend on us. What would happen if we turned around and simply said, you are going to take instructions from me now? So you have got, in the Cape area, you have many leaders who ended up on trial, ended up mutinying against the British, ended up organizing armed rebellion against the British, and many of them would end up on trial. So Langa Libalele is actually part of a long story in South Africa of these military tribunals, because they were often treated as soldiers. And this is when it becomes complicated, that they would be treated as soldiers, but they would not be allowed to defend themselves. And so often, like with Langa Libalele, they would have to have somebody else, a friend of the court, come in and defend them. So Colenso actually acted that role of, it's called the amicus curiae in legal terms. So Colenso was the first amicus curiae in the history of South African law to intervene and say, I am going to submit evidence in favor of the defendant. I'm going to defend the defendant by giving the court an alternative view of events. So that, again, it is a kind of extension of that. Remember that phrase that I told you where he said such exaggerated accounts. So Colenso takes that idea, and also it is present in his report on Langa Libalele. Now, Makemafuze is in the account also as a witness. A debate ensues about the meaning in isiZulu, the difference between ukukhala and ukumangala. I mean, it's the most unbelievable linguistic debate, because Shepstone is basically telling the Amahlubi that they've gone to Colenso ukumangala against him. And they're saying, no, we went there ukuzikhalela enkosini sobantu. We were not ukumangalela. Because now he's trying to make it seem as if they were trying to create a case against him. And Makemafuze and I think Mubi and William Giti then point out that it actually costs money for an African to open a case against someone. I mean, just bizarre sort of kind of these back and forth. And so, as I say, it's a monumental forensic document. And I hope that the chapter in my book on Langa Libalele does justice to just this question of why it is that men like Langa Libalele would often end up being tried as soldiers, even though they were not acknowledged as soldiers when they were working as night watchmen. But when they did something wrong, it was like military tribunal for you. So I try and answer that question specifically. So that's when I go back to the voice of Makemafuze.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a brilliant lecture and for responding to our questions so beautifully. Now I would like to call on Dr. Roshni Patha, who will propose a vote of thanks and closure. As I hand over to Dr. Patha, I would also like to thank you all for the opportunity to facilitate this important program. Over to you, Dr. Partha.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to one and all. On behalf of the university and the library management team, it is my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks. And I think it's our duty to express our gratitude and say thanks to all those people who have made it possible. So first and foremost, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to all the attendees. Thank you for taking the time out from your busy schedule and for your participation. Our distinguished guest speaker, Prof. Shlonipa Mokoena, for sharing her thoughts and experiences and her excellent presentations. Your insights have been invaluable and we are grateful for your time and expertise. Your responses really resonated deeply with me. Wow. Not sure you're aware, but today Hindus across the world start their fast for, to revere our ancestors. So your words really resonated deeply with me. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Mr. Mlela, our facilitator this afternoon, thank you very much. Our director, Dr. Nonhlanhla Knobo, who's here this afternoon. ICS for live streaming this event and recording the lecture for us. Hearty thanks to Ms. Pamela Adams from Corporate Relations for assisting us in bringing this together. And our dedicated organizing team from the library, specifically the staff members at the Killie Campbell Africana Library. All of your contributions have made this annual lecture a memorable and enriching one. Thank you so much.